Now that we've seen how to graph a basic square root and cube root function on our calculator, we're going to look at the one that's a little bit more complicated. Graphing a root function, we're going to say hello to some old friends, A, H, and K. A couple of letters that we use to shift and change the graphs of quadratic functions or parabolas a couple of chapters ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to graph this in your calculator, the square root of x minus 2 plus 1. And then we'll talk about why it does the things that it does. So y equals, I still have the square root function from before. So I have the square root of x. I'm going to make this x minus 2. Well, notice I've got the minus 2. It's still underneath the radical symbol. For those of you with older calculators, you would have just the square root symbol and then a open parentheses here. And then you'd have to close the parentheses after you type in x minus 2. Since I have a newer calculator, I don't need to do that. But now for the plus 1 part, plus 1 is not a part of the square root. So what I need to do is I need to hit the right arrow to move outside of, and you'll notice how all of a sudden the square root symbol stopped. Now I'm out in the open, I'll put plus 1. While we're at it, I'm going to just turn off this cube root function. So all we have to look at is the square root function that we have at first. So the square root function just kind of appears out of the middle of nowhere. Well, there's a reason for that. If I go back to my table and let's make our table setting, set it to independent auto. Go back and look at our table. You'll notice that when I plug in -1, I get an error. When I plug in, which is normal, plugging in 0 now gives me an error as well. And so does plugging in 1. The first x value that I'm able to plug in is 2, and the output there is 1. Plugging in 2 gives me 1. That's the first output, that's okay. If I were to sketch this on my paper, plugging in 2 gives me 1. Plugging in 3, well, 3 minus 2 is 1, and the square root of 1 is 1, plus 1 is 2. And plugging in 6, 6 minus 2 is 4, square root of 4 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3. So here's what my graph looks like. Kind of starts out in the middle of nowhere. Well, it starts at 2, 1. That's where this initial point would be. Now that you've seen how to do that quickly on a calculator, I want to mess with Desmos a little bit and look at a few functions. So here, first of all, is we're going to look at a number that's outside of the square root symbol and what it might do to a square root function. So here I have the square root of x graphed for us. And now a is a slider that I've attached to the front of the square root symbol. When I hit play, it's going to plug in different values for a. Currently a is listed as 1. So when I hit play, watch what happens to the graph. So it gets a little bit bigger and smaller. So as a is 1.11, a little bit bigger, my graph goes up a little bit further. Up till 4, and then I have it come back down. So I'm multiplying by something, and what's happening is it's kind of opening up much taller, a little bit steeper. Now all of a sudden, if it becomes negative, what happens is that same curve that used to be up here is now below the x-axis. So it's the same curve, it's just going in the other direction because it's negative. Now, after we mess with this a little bit, we're going to put this back to 1, the initial value. Just see what it looks like. Down here, I have y equals the square root of x minus h plus k. Now, I'm going to turn off my initial, actually I'll leave it on. I'm going to set h equal to 0 and k equal to 0 right now. You'll notice I have two sides. H is inside the square root symbol, k is outside. I'm going to turn this on. I'll see orange. Now it's the exact same as before because h is 0 and k is 0. So right now the two graphs are the same. The red one and the orange one's just over the top because I have the square root of x minus 0 and then plus 0 on the outside is the same thing as the square root of x up here. Now watch what happens when I set h in motion. H is going to, I'm going to subtract some number from x inside of the square root symbol. I'm going to hit play and watch where it goes. Slide to the right and then to the left. If I pause it somewhere, this is it. It's got the same graph. It didn't really change the curve shape, it's just shifting where it is. So if I make h equal to 2.21, notice where it starts. If I click on the beginning of this graph, it'd be at 2.21, 0. If I hit play again, notice how that x value changes. Now I'm at 4, which is the extent of my slider that I had it at. So 4 is the initial x value. Right now, if you can imagine, we're graphing the square root of x minus 4. Well, 4 is the first value that I can plug in that gives me 0 for a radicand. If I were to change my slider, make it negative, something like this, -2. Now I'd have x minus -2, which is really saying x plus 2 is inside here. And -2 in that case would be the first x value that I could plug in. That would allow me to take the square root of 0, which is the first part of my domain. Now if I were to turn k loose, we'll set h back to 0. If I were to work with k on the slide on the outside, watch what happens to the graph. Same curve, but now this one just shifts up and down. Same curve, just shifting up and down a little bit. And that point is not one that I necessarily wanted. If I were to click on the starting point right here and kind of follow this as I hit play again, or to stop it somewhere about here, click on it. You know, 0 is the x value, because that's the first x value I can plug in, because it's x by 0 at the moment. But plus k, so 1.6 is my first output. So k slides the graph up and down. H slides the graph left and right. Keeping that idea in mind going back here. H is 2, K is 1. So I slid 2 to the right and up 1. Now here's where this is important to me. This affects my domain. The domain here is x values that are greater than or equal to 2. Because 2 is the value of H. 2 is the first x value that I can plug in. It gives me the square root of 0, and that's where I usually start. The range would be y values that are greater than or equal to 1, because 1 is the first output. 1 is the output of this initial point on my square root graph. Keeping that idea in mind, I think you'll know where this is going. If I have the opposite of the square root of x plus 3 minus 3, this graph would shift 3 to the left, because I think of this as, I use the opposite of h. So 3 to the left, 1, 2, 3. Then the -3 on the outside means I'm going to shift down 3 as well. Down 1, 2, 3. So my initial point is going to be at -3, -3. -3 because that's the first x value I can plug in and not have the square root of a negative number. -3 would be the output there. Now this negative sign in the front, remember when I put a negative sign in front of the square root function, it flipped it over. Well, instead of going up and to the right, this graph is going to go down and to the right. Domain would be x values that are greater than or equal to -3. The range is a little bit different. Because it goes down from that point, my y values in my range are now less than or equal to -3. So there you've got looking at some square root functions that have shifted left and right and up and down, and how that affects their domain and range.